So we just started before the Chinese New Year break looking at the work of Kandinsky. I filled in a little bit about the background of the beginnings of his career. I like to show the early work of artists because I think often it's kind of revealing of what their sources are, the ingredients that go into their style, even before they find their own signature style. A lot of his orientation to art is already more towards the imagination than towards the objective world around, and I wanted to present that as very much a choice. You know, that there were artists in Russia in the late 19th century who thought very much that the important thing was to move, to engage with social reality. The broad title of this course, Modernity and its Discontents, some people want to engage with all the problematic nature of the modern world, use art as a channel for highlighting injustices and so forth. Kandinsky, I could say he's in his own way very much responding to the modern world, but you might want to say it's a strategy more of escapism or somehow a sort of spiritual critique of the materialism of the modern world rather than attempt to engage with it on its own terms and to try and change it through social action, say. So we're looking here at the work The Motley Life of 1907, an example of his early work, a little bit similar in style, although there's a lot more figures in it, to the work I showed at the end last week called The Couple Riding. It's more like a work populated by things from folklore and fairy tale literature. He's very interested in Russian folklore, and actually that's quite a question that might come up, to what extent we want to see Kandinsky as a Russian artist. Each country has its own culture. He is a Russian, but he also studied in Germany. There's a sort of German phase to his work, and then ended up his life in Paris. You can break down his life in terms of where he's living in 3 different countries and social environments, really. So that's some kind of issue, the extent to which an artist's place of residence or his original nationality might influence his approach to art. Specifically, we're going to see him as one of the pioneers of abstract art, and is there anything in the Russian tradition that helps with that? We just see in the news recently a meeting between the head of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Catholic Pope in Cuba, and it's announced, this is the first meeting between these 2 heads of these churches for 1,000 years or something like that. There's a big schism in Christianity between East and West in terms of doctrinal belief that is still there today. So, that's one basis on which there may be a difference between Russian art and the art of Western Europe. So much of the art of the Renaissance and the Renaissance tradition is art of Catholicism. It's art of the Western Church. Russian Orthodox art took a very different route. It didn't really have a Renaissance. There was a great deal of continuity with the earlier Byzantine tradition that artists like Giotto and all the people who came after him move away from. So maybe if you're a Russian artist, you weren't so bought into illusionism and the kind of realistic tradition that the Renaissance created. You had alternative cultural resources outside all of that. It's easy perhaps to understand that idea here, because the same thing would be true of a Chinese artist, that they have their own native cultural traditions that they can turn to. They may show an interest in illusionistic realism, but they have alternative resources that they can draw on in terms of artistic history. So working more from the imagination, working from literature, folklore and so forth. The Motley Life is the title. Motley means sort of variegated. I think here it means all different kinds of people jumbled up together. Motley can also refer to clothing, like the clothing of a clown, say, with all different colours put together. And some of the clothing here is indeed quite mixed. We're seeing, a certain kind of stylization. Not too much concern for that much realistic detail. It's a sort of flat kind of style, two-dimensional quality, dialogue with illustration rather than just with high art as a possible source here. It's interesting, I think, to look at the subject matter of these works, because in some sense the subjects do reappear later in his borderline abstract works, but in those works it's harder to identify the subject. But say the castle on a hill, we could call it a Kremlin. People talk about the Kremlin in Moscow, but Kremlin will just mean a kind of like a walled city or compound. Well, that's a motif, a walled city on a hill that you'll see in later works by Kandinsky. A figure holding a staff. I think we'll see similar motifs later. Maybe he's a priest. Color is very bright. Color is important. Color is moving away from naturalism. Again, it's moving away from realism. Kandinsky moved to Munich when he decided to become an artist. He was 30. I think I said this at the end last time. He was 30 before he took up a career as an artist. Before that, he had a career as a lawyer, even being offered a kind of professorship in law, which he turned down to go to Munich to become an art student. We tend to think of Paris as, in Walter Benjamin's terms, the capital of the 19th century, the most important artistic and intellectual centre in Europe of that century. But if you're way out in Russia, that Paris is quite a long way away, well, Kandinsky did go there. It was an important place for him to go. But artists from the eastern part of Europe might feel that they are attracted to other centres. So Munich would be one of the ones you could go to. Vienna might be another. He went to Munich, so in the German-speaking world. There he joined the class of the artist Franz Von Schaack, who we can think of as a symbolist painter. If you go to Munich, you can see a museum of Franz Von Schaack's work in his former house. It's quite an interesting place to visit. So Von Schaack is an artist who is not really, is also working from the imagination. He's already part of that symbolist trend, which is working away from realism. So Kandinsky is reinforcing tendencies he already has. The most important new thing in town, if you're a student coming to study, you're interested in what's happening now. And what was happening now, what was the most sort of trendy kind of trend, was Art Nouveau, or as it was referred to in the German-speaking world, Jugendstil, the style of youth. Art Nouveau, the French term, new art, basically. It's a pan-European tendency. You can see examples of it in the arts of various different European countries. And it's not just in the visual arts narrowly defined, it's perhaps even more so in the area of design that you see it. I'll show you a couple of examples in a moment. Often it involves using forms that come from natural origin, organic kind of forms, but in a very stylized way. So I think it would have been another of the influences that helps push Kandinsky more towards abstraction, that tendency to the very stylized design that you have in Art Nouveau. So while he was there, Kandinsky starts making, objects like this. It's just a small purse for putting your sewing materials in. A decorative object rather than a pure art object, a functional but decorative object. That's already the world that Art Nouveau inhabits. Or he's producing little drawings that try out different designs. As a designer, you could get involved with, I'm trying to get a nice abstract pattern. I'm going to use it on a practical object. I'm not thinking of this as abstract art that I'm making, but actually that's what you're doing. You're thinking just in terms of forms, pure forms, and that's enough, So you've already broken a lot of the ties with realism. So this is just a little drawing, in Kandinsky's work, decorative design with circles and wavy lines. But already it's just to produce something like this, you have to think just about forms and not about content. It doesn't have a story to tell. There's no literature behind it. So this is Art Nouveau, and two of the most important Art Nouveau artists in Munich at that time, August Endel, this is the first I'm going to show you. This is his designs for the facade of the Atelier Elvira. It's a photographic studio. He did this in 1896. So it's actually made of stucco, just on the facade of the building. This sort of stylized wave-like form. This is typical of Art Nouveau, whiplash lines, dramatic kind of linear effects. You can see the whole window decoration is also very distinctive. And here's the other, major figure in Art Nouveau in Munich at that time, Obrist. Kandinsky got to meet him. So this is, it's just a piece of wall hanging. Again, it's got this sort of whiplash line. This time not from a wave form, but from a plant form, stylized plant form. That's so typical of Art Nouveau. Piece of embroidery. The artist here, Endel, in 1898 he wrote that artists were standing at the beginning of the development of a totally new art with forms which mean nothing and represent nothing and recall nothing, which move us profoundly, as strongly as hitherto only the sounds of music have been able. So he's talking there at the very end of the 19th century about the possibility of an art which doesn't really have a subject, it's just made from forms. He's talking about the possibility of an abstract art. That's before abstract art ever was made. But I think it's interesting that sort of art theory in that way creates a sort of space for abstract art. It imagines abstract art before the reality of it occurs. It's almost kind of, it's like something waiting to happen. When it does come along, the place is already cleared for it. Art theorists of the late 19th century had often emphasized the formal dimension of art, even when they're looking at paintings that do have subject matter. There's a very famous statement by the painter and writer Maurice Denis about how first and foremost a painting is a flat surface covered with colours and shapes arranged in a certain order, and only after that is it a battle scene, a nude woman, or something like that. So the prioritization of the formal dimension and the idea that forms and colours of themselves could be enough to, or are what is essential to make a work of art, that already has kind of well prepared the ground for abstraction. Maybe Art Nouveau started with the work of William Morris, if you want to find a starting point. His stylized plant forms. This is actually from a piece of wallpaper he created. He was very involved in a sort of revival of medieval or Gothic traditions in art. Stylized plant forms you can find in Gothic art. And his work was admired across Europe. One very famous example of Art Nouveau would be the metro station entrance signs of Guimard in Paris. There's still a few of these original ones there that haven't been replaced. A few stations still have them. Again, organic, stylized forms. It's a functional object, but still we're within the world of art. Another thing nudging Kandinsky towards abstraction was seeing the work of Monet, in particular Monet's haystack paintings. He gives an account of this himself. He says, "Up till then I'd known nothing but realist art, and suddenly for the first time I saw a picture. The catalogue told me that it was a haystack. I couldn't tell it from looking. Not being able to tell it upset me. I also considered that the artist had no right to paint so indistinctly. I had the dull sensation that the picture's subject was missing, and was amazed and confused to realize that the picture did not merely fascinate but impressed itself indelibly on my memory and constantly floated before my eyes quite unexpectedly, completing every detail. I did not understand any of this, and I was quite unable to draw the simple conclusions from the experience. What was plain to me, however, was that the palette, that means colour, had a strength that I had never before suspected, far beyond anything I had ever dreamt. Painting acquired a fairy tale splendour and strength, and at the same time, although I did not realize it, the subject as an essential element of the picture was discredited." Maybe it's a little bit hard for us to look at a Monet painting now and see it as a kind of quasi-abstract art, but we have to try to recover, a sense of looking that is, of that period where this was really something new. Monet has, Impressionism in general has affected so much how we think about the world, that the world has started to look like an Impressionist painting more. So, we don't get so surprised when we look at images like this, as Kandinsky was. Well, I've been talking about this involvement of Kandinsky with the world of the imagination and the influence of the symbolist art of Franz Von Schaack, or the abstractedness of Art Nouveau. But in Munich he also was engaging with landscape, something actually out there in the real world. he moved to live in a small town called Murnau, just outside of Munich, painting landscapes there. And he's accompanied by two other artists. One is Gabriel Munter, they're in a relationship, and the other is Jarlensky, a Russian friend. So although he's painting from the scenery around, the mountain scenery which is outside of the town, it's still a very simplified, reductive approach. There's a whole sort of history of art that I haven't actually kind of painted in for you here, which is in the background. There already had been artists in Germany who had been working in an expressionistic style. The artists of the Bridge group, the Die Brücke group, like Kirchner. We'll look at them later, in fact, when we look at German expressionism as a phenomenon. But Kandinsky could be seen as a German expressionist. He's part of the German expressionist story, although he's a Russian artist. But I've sort of separated him out to look at him as one of the pioneers of abstract art. So I'm putting him in a different box, but he could be placed in that expressionism box as well. So expressionism and art more concerned with feeling, with emotion. And colour, of course, was the main means through which emotion could be expressed. This is, an influence from artists. Ultimately, you can trace this back to the post-impressionists, to artists like, preeminently, Van Gogh. Now, artists in France had carried on from the influence of Van Gogh. There were the Fauves, Matisse, and the circle of artists around him called the Fauves. They exhibited their works from 1904, 1905. That was the key moment of Fauvism, short-lived movement. Certainly, Kandinsky was aware of their work, as he no doubt would be aware of other German artists responding to it, like the Die Brücke artists. So all that is part of the influence. He himself had been to Paris, as I said before. He'd seen their work. He'd exhibited in Paris at the Autumn Salon. He connected with that art world, even though Munich was his main base. So all that is there in the background. We're looking at here at the work Landscape Murnau of 1907. I could compare it with a Fauve work just to give you some point of comparison. This is a work not by Matisse, the most famous figure associated with Fauvism, but Derain, very prominent figure, fishing port at Collioure, 1905. You see with Fauvism this movement away from naturalism, heightened, non-realistic colour scheme. It has that in common with the Kandinsky, but I think there are differences too. So you can't just see Kandinsky as following in the footsteps of the Fauves. He's got something of his own here. Although the colours are not naturalistic in the Derain painting, I think it's very much still in an impressionistic tradition. It's art that's trying to evoke a sense of atmosphere, the way the Impressionists did, heat and light. It's a more hedonistic kind of art. Somehow with Kandinsky, the feeling is of a more heightened emotional mood, a more sense of emotional tension or spirituality, something like that, which I don't feel there in the more relaxed environment of a south of France fishing port. It's a more everyday world. This is more wild nature. Okay, there are signs of human habitation, but they're small in the face of the mountains. The mountains are introduce a sense of vastness, or God's nature dwarfing man, something like that. We're encouraged towards we're thinking of the romantic landscape traditions of the 19th century, not just of Fauvism. The colours are slightly different. They're more acid, less the more pure primaries that you get here in the Derain. The mixing in of white to produce these slightly pastel shades, which you get with Matisse as well. I'm thinking about this sort of thing. And of course the white ground, that also helps create a different kind of mood. This is much more a kind of tense sort of mood, or extreme in mood, heightened in mood, more spiritual in... maybe you say it's like in musical terms, it's in a minor key rather than a major key, or something like that. I'm just trying to find metaphors. There's no right way to express it, but I think I hope you get the idea what I'm trying to say. Here's another example, help you to plot where he's at this point. Street in Murnau, 1908. And I think it's important that he's not on his own. He's there with his two friends who are part of the same exploration as him. It is, art is a kind of language, and you can't just be the sole speaker of a language. The language is not going to thrive very well. And that wasn't the case. There were other people around. So here's an example, say, of Jarlenski's work, his Russian friend, from that same time and place. At this point in time, maybe Jarlenski's work is, I think, as good as Kandinsky's. It's just that Jarlenski doesn't really make the same next step that Kandinsky does after this point. This is what, by the way, Murnau actually looks like if you try and look at it from it's a photo from an old postcard, But you can see the mountain scenery in the background, the wild kind of scenery that attracted Kandinsky to this place, I'm pretty sure. Round about this time, there's another experience that Kandinsky has, which he in his own story, helped to push him towards abstraction. I think I'm going to read it to you, but of course you should be a little bit wary of how artists tell you their own story, or anyone tells you their version of their biography. It's always there are many things happen in someone's life, and then they will remember certain parts of it and knit it together as one neat narrative. But as historians, we of course we want to question that. We want to not take someone's own narrative as definitely being the one that we want to use. There's another funny thing that can happen. I remember once interviewing an artist called Robert Motherwell, an American abstract expressionist artist, and after a while interviewing him, I start to... he's talking about himself, but I'm kind of aware which book about him he's sort of quoting. He's actually telling his story through someone else's version of it. So all this is it's all an interesting thing. History, we often think of history as a sort of factually based, but there's also a sense in which history is narrative, or there's a literary dimension to it. We have to think about how do you start, when you give your presentation, think about how do I start my presentation, how do I end it, Those are literary questions rather than purely historical questions. So even more so in the field of biography is there this sort of literary structuring. But anyway, with that caveat, that warning, let me just read you what Kandinsky says he's experienced one time. Evening was drawing in. I just come home with my paints and brushes after working on a sketch, still abstracted and absorbed in what I'd been doing, when suddenly I saw an indescribably beautiful picture suffused with inner radiance. I stood gaping at first, then I rushed up to this mysterious picture, in which I could see nothing but forms and colour, and whose subject was incomprehensible. At once I discovered the answer to the puzzle. It was one of my own pictures that was leaning against the wall on its side. So again, it's a little kind of anecdote about, maybe we can move towards abstraction. This is a work which, strictly speaking, is usually referred to as study for composition 4, but it's sometimes been called the Cossacks. Cossacks are kind of mounted soldiers, or a certain kind of people within the multi-ethnic, Russian world, and maybe the hats of these figures look like the distinctive Cossack hats, or maybe the figures on horseback lead people to think of this as the Cossacks. So it's also, I think, being referred to as the battle. But let's just call it study for composition 4. This, by the way, is composition 4. So there's a pattern over the next few years, particularly, where Kandinsky will make studies for other more finished works. So the studies are slightly more spontaneous, maybe. So you can see they're related, but not exactly the same. Actually, maybe the final work, composition 4, may be a little bit more abstracted. Well, we're still in a kind of landscape environment, so there's some continuity with the works he was producing in Murnau, the landscape works of the previous phase. But also there's some of the imagery that was there in his earlier works. For example, this castle on a hill. Certain images come back, but the style has changed. It's not purely abstract, but definitely it's become a lot more abstract than anything we've seen so far. After a while, I think we can begin to make out what the forms refer to. Maybe at first we're just aware of forms. We see this as one form. Later we see them maybe as arms of figures, or maybe weapons held in the arms of figures. A figure on a horseback, 2 horses with riders, and the horses are rearing up. Maybe this is where the title battle comes from, a sense that the horse's legs are entangled even. 2 figures in combat. Are they on a bridge? Maybe a rainbow bridge. Sometimes in mythology you have rainbow bridges, sort of magical links between different realms. Sort of fairy tale idea, or mythological idea. Well, these seem to be 3 figures standing. Maybe they're holding lances. One's holding some kind of walking stick, or we saw a figure holding a stick like that in the Motley Life, the first one I showed you earlier. What are these? Maybe these are birds in the sky. That would be a plausible explanation. So actually we could probably tie down almost everything that we see as representing something. But clearly Kandinsky has chosen to not produce a clear, realistic likeness of anything. He's trying to place attention on the the forms and colours in their own right. And to the extent that he's concerned with subject matter, he wants to maybe keep it deliberately a bit vague so that you won't take a kind of literal-minded attitude towards it. You won't think of it purely in a sort of illustrative way, as you could do with his earlier works, perhaps. He's trying to defeat too much of a literal-minded approach. He actually makes this clear. He says at one point, when the spectator imagines he is in fairyland, he becomes automatically immune to strong internal vibrations, so the artist's effort miscarries. We must find, therefore, a form which excludes a fairy tale effect and which does not hinder pure colour action. To this end, form, movement, colour, natural and imaginary objects must be divorced from any narrative intent. We break up any storytelling, he's saying, and I don't want you to believe in a world where bridges literally are made of rainbows. By presenting this in a less realistic way, I want you to realize it's a symbol. Maybe I'm a bit worried that we're all living in such a materialistic world that people are too literal-minded and materialistic about everything. So I've got to develop a style of making art that will confound you and prevent you from being so literal-minded. I've got to prevent misunderstanding in that way. And perhaps I'm particularly worried about that because the kind of art that I made earlier on was itself more like a sort of fairy tale illustration. So I'm rejecting my own earlier art. This is a kind of conjecture about what Kandinsky is doing. He wants the forms and colours themselves to help carry the meaning, the expressive meaning. Feelings you can't describe anyway, you've got to evoke through forms and colours. So realism isn't going to help you. The abstract elements in their own right should carry a certain kind of weight. When he talks himself about composition 4, he doesn't really talk about the subject matter at all. He talks about the contrast of the masses to the lines, of the definite to the vague, of knotted lines to coloured dots, and as the main contrast, an angled sharp movement to the light, cold, sweet colours. The whole composition is intended to be light, with many sweet colours, which often absorb each other. The yellow is also cold. So that's his way of talking about this, almost in a formalistic kind of way, rather than thinking about subject matter at all. Well, what are we to make of this symbolism? Well, like I say, I can only sort of conjecture. There's no kind of key to this symbolism. It's not like in the Baroque era where you can look it up in a book and say, oh, a woman with a trumpet means fame. It's not that symbolism in that kind of codified way. So this is just a sort of conjecture that, the rainbow bridge could be like a bridge between two realms. The hero maybe needs to go on a journey, an adventure, like in the search for the Holy Grail or these kind of mythic narratives. That journey maybe is what would it be? A journey to find the hidden treasure. It's a symbolic way of talking about a journey of spiritual self-discovery. Ultimately, it's a journey into yourself, but presented as an odyssey of some kind. You're searching for a ring or something like that, the Lord of the Rings, all these different kind of narratives. They all have some similarity to them, at least according to certain ways of thinking, like the Jungian psychological theory, or Joseph Campbell, who wrote the book called A Hero with a Thousand Faces, trying to say that there are patterns in human mythology. A arduous journey of spiritual self-discovery where you have to go through battle to get across a threshold, and eventually you'll penetrate to the place where the secret can be found or the treasure can be gained, something like that. That would be perhaps one way of conjecturing the meaning here. Looking at it as a, just in a formal way, clearly he's used a lot of white. He's painted a kind of white surface first, and then other colours are added onto that. Maybe some white has been added on top of those other colours too, but the white reads as a kind of ground. Remember at the very end last week I showed you a work of his that was a print, talking about how in print, a woodblock print, you're cutting away the very area that represents the form sometimes. You're having to think about the marks I'm making are the very areas that will be the empty spaces that won't be printed. So you're thinking about form and negative. And that's very much what Kandinsky is doing here. Maybe some of his early training with prints has helped him. So say the form of the castle on the hill is just represented by the white. It's just a simple outline. The white is also representing the sky. It's only the line that makes that a solid area. So it links that form, with other forms. The forms of the riders very close to the surrounding white inside and outside, and the line is a bit broken, so it allows a kind of permeability between the internal and external space. Makes it more of a two-dimensional composition, a unified two-dimensional composition. The colours are separate dots of colour. We can add them together to say, oh, well, that's maybe the head. But we're aware of individual touches of colour. Often quite thin, translucent paint. So previous layers show through. With the final version of Composition 4, there isn't quite so much of that empty white, but you still get the same feeling that there's continuity between what is inside and outside, between form and background, solid and void. You see the line in both works, line and colour, they keep their independence. There's line and there's colour, but they don't sort of march together, telling you the same story. So, for example, the line is saying, "Oh, this is a very strong boundary here, the castle, the wall, or whatever," but the colour is saying, "Oh, I don't care about that. I'm just going across this. I don't even acknowledge it exists." So this is saying solid, 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 and this is saying no. It's saying continuity. So there's there's like a counterpoint going, if you like, two different rhythms at the same time, something like that. So through colour introduces some kind of fluidity or unification to the image. I think fluidity is an important thing in a lot of the works of Kandinsky of this time. By having a more abstracted style, each individual visual element is free to count directly in its own right. Line, colour. A line is no longer subservient as it is in representational art to tell you the outline. It can do what it wants to do. Is it interesting and powerful as a line in its own right? Colour the same. Instead of telling you the particular fall of light on the clothing of a particular figure, that's not important. That's not a concern of Kandinsky at all. Let's take a short break there.